Hello, everyone. It's Nate. Due to a scheduling error this week, Francis and I were unable to record an episode, so I've chosen to unlock a recent bonus episode featuring myself and Alice Caldwell-Kelly of Trashfuture, Well, There's Your Problem, and Kill James Bond podcasts, in which we discuss the Armando Ianucci film In the Loop. Just FYI, all of our bonus content from all the way back to 2016 is available on the Patreon for $5 a month. We put out one bonus a week, and I greatly appreciate your patience. Thanks, and hope you enjoy.
Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. He ain't gonna jump no more. Zoom, zoom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this bonus episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. It is myself, Nate. No Francis. He is dealing with some homeowner stuff right now. However, I have brought on Alice Caldwell-Kelly from a number of podcasts, Trashfuture, Well, There's Your Problem, Kill James Bond, and general lover of military content. Alice, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Pleasure to be here as substitute Francis.
Well, we could go into dad/mom chat here and just talk about our garden/building/whatever's going on. But I don't know. Francis is always having like hot weather gardening success where he plants like a pepper plant and the next day it's literally like providing shade on his entire house.
Oh my God.
I can't grow anything in this fucking country because if it's not bad weather, it's just worms eating it. Because it's slugs, snails, British gardens, man. Like they have all this greenery from weeds and they're just like, no, I'm going to kill the thing you would like.
Yeah, gardening here is impossible. I don't recommend it to anybody. The earth itself is like cursed and is displeased with its habitation.
Well, it's also just like Britain is eternal autumn. It's like 11 and a half months of autumn a year. And
like, give it like 10 to 15 years and we'll have a nice Mediterranean climate that's going to kill off all of the worms and you'll be able to have like a nice vineyard in
exactly.
in Peckham. Yeah.
I'll have a new microclimate in Peckham, allowing me to grow my own vintage. I get Master Sommelier Riley to tell me my wines are shit. So we decided to have this episode today because we were both having a discussion about general officers, and you brought up James Gandolfini's portrayal of a major general, or rather a lieutenant general, in the Armando Ianucci film In the Loop.
Yes,
which
I
is
did.
more or less a, the thick of it /Veep/Death of Stalin style sort of like situation political comedy.
The thick of it goes to America, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. The thick of it goes to America, and it's about the Iraq War. And James Gandolfini does, in fact, play a lieutenant general who is effectively opposed to this proposed war and is constantly buffeted by some of the most psychotic Scottish men in existence. So I was going to just very briefly summarize the plot. And we don't have to go through a full summary because it's relatively simple. It's basically about a dim bulb British cabinet minister who's the minister for like
International development,
who winds up basically making a faux pas about the possibility of war, saying that he saw as unforeseeable, but the British government doesn't want to completely rule it out. So they wind up, he through a comedy of errors, he winds up becoming their point man in Washington for a bunch of meetings about it, which the Secretary of Defense and I believe the Undersecretary of Defense are at loggerheads about this stuff. And effectively, there's some back and forth. They create a dodgy dossier out of a report written that more or less sides against the war. That gets read out at the UN, and they vote to authorize the military action. And so that's basically it. The plot is quite simple. It's mostly just people yelling at each other.
It's played pretty straight, but it's like, the idea is that the UK is sort of like, it focuses on the sort of like the underlings, the sort of like careerists, sort of like junior ministers at like joke jobs like international development and their staff, things like that, and like assistant secretaries of state, and just sort of like extremely like venal and cowardly people being like buffeted this way and that because the president and the prime minister want to invade Iraq, and they're just kind of like not certain of that being a good idea.
So effectively, we never meet the prime minister or the president.
No.
However, we do meet the head of media relations for Number 10, and his deputy, both of whom are insane Scottish men. Now, I believe one of them is supposed to. I believe the one Malcolm is supposed to be Alistair Campbell, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, they're sort of like conglomerates, but like, Alistair Campbell is the obvious model for Malcolm Tucker. And if you've seen any of the thick of it, you remember Malcolm Tucker because Peter Capaldi sort of steals that entire series by sort of like berating people in like extremely obscene and like threatening ways. And we kind of get him taken out of his element in this movie. So where he's previously sort of like shouting at junior ministers in London, he's now in Washington, D.C. being sort of like outplayed by State Department neoconservatives.
Yes, and basically cursing at people and calling them morons, and basically this entire show is just one nonstop run of really dim bulb people fucking bullying each other.
Yes.
I'm kind of conflicted because, I run a whole podcast about why you shouldn't join the military and the military is bad, but I also want like James Gandolfini to just beat the shit out of the Alistair Campbell analog. I'm just like, no, you fucking Scottish limey, shut the fuck up. You don't, nope, you don't get to do that. Nope. And it's just like, I had something, I did enjoy the scenes that James Gandolfini was in.
He steals this movie.
Oh, he's great. He's absolutely great.
This is the thing. Like James Gandolfini is such a good actor that he will like steal any movie that you put him in. And so he's got a relatively minor character of this sort of like anti-war, like sort of lib principled opposition within the Pentagon general officer. He's got like maybe like half a dozen scenes. Most of the plot is about like chinless British people being ridiculous and pathetic, and yet he just absolutely dominates this movie.
It's also very funny because he is, for somebody who is so, how do you describe this, as a very opposed to unnecessary war guy. I'm not like a master reader of ribbons and badges and stuff like that. Like I never really cared that much. I recognize.
He's got a lot of them. He's got
but he's got he's got three
CIBs.
Three CIBs. He's got two stars on his CIB, which means that that would effectively mean if this is supposed to predate Iraq, this would seem to imply if Afghanistan exists, if there is an Afghan war, this would seem to imply that he's a veteran of Vietnam and the Gulf War and Afghanistan. But he would be a general, can't get a CIB because past a certain point, you're no longer infantry branch. You are general officer branch. Like it's a weird thing that works. When you hit general, you're no longer. So that's why David Petraeus has a combat action badge, but not a combat infantryman's badge because he wasn't technically an infantryman when he was commanding the 101st Airborne. Because of the way general officer stuff works, he'd be ineligible for it. So that actually would imply, given that this guy's a 3-star and Iraq or Afghanistan would be relatively recent, this would seem to imply that he has either fought in both Vietnam and like Grenada/Panama and the Gulf War, or
somehow
he's a World War II veteran.
Yeah, he was in Korea.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, Korea's another one too.
There is a really good scene because the big like climactic scene and sort of the heart of this movie is Malcolm Tucker, this like Scottish spin doctor, fighting with James Gandolfini as this General Miller in the UN, having just like authorized military action in what we presume to be Iraq. And he gives him like the question, have you ever killed anybody? And he's just like, yeah. It's played so fucking well. And then later on after this, he gets in another argument, and the sort of like Hillary Clinton figure, the assistant secretary of state, is like, she tells him you're not a soldier, like because you've just been doing general stuff for too long, you're just like out of it. And he says the army doesn't make you like drag a corpse back every 5 years to renew your soldier license.
I appreciated him telling Malcolm Tucker that he's just like, you might be a really important poodle fucker over there, but here you're nothing. It's just like, yeah, that's incredible. Like,
the politics of this movie are really weird because it's like about the sort of like Anglo-American, about the special relationship, right? But it's I don't know. In some ways, I feel like it's almost too kind to Britain, because it always makes us sort of like overawed by America and like fawning towards America, which is true, right? But like in sort of a like bumbling way rather than an actively like depraved way.
It strikes me that there is an extent to which British people are somewhat impressed by some of like the excessively big, grandiose things that America offers, big cars and big refrigerators, but that like they also think that we're very gauche and simplistic and
it's very
and
interesting. I found a Guardian article when this came out with Armando Ianucci, the writer, where he says that part of In the Loop is about how stupidly weak-kneed we Brits get when we think of America, of how we lose our dignity and even our principles once we get the chance to soak up American culture. And I'm just like,
I think the thing for me is that I don't necessarily know if British people admire America so much as they find America to be an interesting place.
Sure.
Like, my impression is that there are some people who would love to see Britain more like America, but those people tend to be completely insane. And also, like, the kind of people who would probably be miserable if they were subject to any of the things that the average American is subject to.
Yeah. Well, there's like a very well-observed scene in the middle of this movie when the British junior minister, who has inadvertently been made the sort of point man for the case for war, and his advisor go to Washington DC, and they get to ride in like I guess it's a Secret Service motorcade, but they have a police escort and they're in a limo, and they're just so overawed by it that the advisor like sticks his head out of the window like a dog.
Yeah, and is filming with his like shitty phone camera.
Yeah, I really appreciated that, but like the idea that we have some greater like sense of principle that like we get too shy to employ when we're around Americans. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that it's quite exculpatory towards us.
I think it's actually the opposite. My impression has been that British people, when they get put around Americans, love to fucking go on about how fucking stupid America is and how great Britain is, and just like genuinely like, you know, Riley's observation that there's a certain kind of British liberal that loves to lecture you with the affect of someone who doesn't realize they're reading from a book upside down. Like that is more the case, that there's this kind of like, we'll call it slightly condescending. But I also think that that's also probably more to do with the class of person who invariably is, you know, in those situations, because like, you know, I've met British tourists, like working class British tourists in America, and they're normally just, you know, relatively normal people. There's like whatever, you know, like, yeah, everywhere has air conditioning and this place fucking sucks, but like, you know, there's Las Vegas is cool and Florida is cool and stuff like that, you know. It's just like,
yeah.
I'm not my impression is that, you know, the shitness of America and the shitness of Britain, if you're on like the receiving end, it's a relatively similar feeling. But I do think that there's a certain kind of, call it a sort of like imperial affect that some like fancier people will sometimes.
Oh yeah,
deploy.
we love pretending that we're the Greece to your Rome. You know, we gave you all of the culture and stuff, and then you transformed it into like the successful empire.
Yeah, there is that, isn't there? Like, I think the thing that gets me about it is watching this film. What I guess I was taken aback by was I don't know enough about what politics is like in America to tell you, like, in terms of what it's like to actually work on Capitol Hill. I couldn't tell you if it was accurate. I couldn't tell you if the British side was accurate. But the one thing that I could say that I did find very funny was the fact that this guy, the junior minister, keeps getting pulled into just like middling, annoying shit in his constituency in Northampton.
Yes,
because that's a thing that, like, yes, American Congress people have to deal with, but they don't do constituency surgeries the same way that British politicians do.
No, and like even the Prime Minister has to do constituency surgeries, and it's this really weird parochial thing, right? Like imagining you know, the president having to go back to Delaware once a month in order to talk about like boundary disputes, right? Is just it doesn't compute, right? But that's just embedded in our system, and that ultimately provides the sort of like thing that allows Malcolm Tucker, Alistair Campbell, to like outmaneuver the last little bit of like principled opposition to the war that this minister has left. He tries to resign in protest when the war, when it becomes clear that the war is going through, and Tucker arranges to get him fired due to like ostensibly some constituency shit that is
basically because a constituent's mother's house has a wall next to like his council or his constituency office, and the wall is apparently going to fall down, and so that's apparently become through Malcolm Tucker's iron grip of the British media. That apparently is the way he gets his revenge on this guy.
Yeah. Malcolm Tucker is strange in this movie because there are moments where he like he's there to sort of advance the more effectively cynical bits of this. Like after he forces this minister out, one of the things that he says to him with a completely straight face is that like, if you want to make this into an anti-war thing, then I will marshal all of the media forces of darkness to hound you to an assisted suicide. And you get the sense that this is a less hyperbolic threat than the ones that he typically issues, and it's I think meant to put you in mind of, for instance, David Kelly, the weapons inspector, who was exactly that, hounded to an assisted suicide by the press for essentially trying to hinder the progress of the war in Iraq.
I have to ask. I know that you're a bit younger than me, so you may not recall it super well, but I'm wondering, like, do you have any recollections of how this stuff was prosecuted in British media? Like how the sort of, what the spin was?
I was really young, but I genuinely remember being reasonably certain that like the UK was going to be bombed, was going to be like attacked by Scud missile. And like I remember asking my parents about that, like should I be worried about this happening? Because that was the line that the newspapers led with was like weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear or chemical or bacteriological weapon strikes against the UK on a 45-minute notice. And
which is just wild to me, but yeah.
The idea that like you could launch, say, a nuclear strike on the UK from Iraq and not have Iraq then turned into a very large, very shiny parking lot. That was just like implicit. It was just like, oh, well, there's nothing we can do to stop this other than engage in a land invasion and then occupation of Iraq.
It's weird because a friend of mine is now a professional photographer, but when he was a student photographer, he worked over here for a while, and he spent some time taking photos at the site where they repatriate the remains of British troops killed overseas.
Oh, Wootton Bassett.
Yeah, Wootton Bassett, yeah. And one thing that he told me, because he and I are from the same hometown, is that he was struck by how much people in Britain were really angry at the government and opposed the war compared to America, where like, yeah, lots of people marched against the war, don't get me wrong, but public polling for opinions at the time had polling support among Americans like above 85% for the war. It's grim. It's really grim. And like, that's not to say, oh, pat yourself on the back if you were pro-Iraq or some shit, because fuck that. I was 18 when it happened. I was just kind of confused by it. I just didn't think they were actually going to do it.
Yeah.
But like a lot of people who basically are being, in my opinion, being kind of overly generous with how much public opposition to the war there was. It was aggressively demonized by American news media, culture, etc. And so my friend was struck by that, how much more opposed to the war people were here.
Talking. The more Americans that I talk to about this, the more I feel that it is different, right? Because like, I was talking on Well, There's Your Problem. We talked about the Dixie Chicks and their cancellation for saying in the UK that they were ashamed that George W. Bush was from Texas. I think genuinely it was like the vibe in the UK, and I think this goes some way to explaining why our politics are so psychotic, is that everybody was against the war. I mean, the largest protests in British political history, it was just like, and yet it turned out not to matter at all, because like having the parliamentary sort of executive system that we developed, and essentially like 4 newspapers on side, was enough to like tip the scale totally in the opposite direction. And I think that a lot of people came out of the Iraq War feeling absolutely powerless to change politics in this country. And I think that's largely persisted. I think it's like a big story of like sort of like hopes for any kind of like alteration, even if it was just like, oh, we're going to invade Iraq but smartly or whatever. Even that wasn't accommodated. It was absolutely something that was imposed top down with like a lot less popular support than the US.
And so in a way, it feels like a film like this, while sort of being a fly on the wall, you know, about the politics involved, has an obvious sort of like bitter note about the war having gone through and the fuckery involved.
Well, that's like we see essentially every character in this have their principles destroyed one way or the other.
But it's funny to me because it's like America didn't. It took a lot longer for us to start having movies like this that actually would have been addressing this along these lines. I mean, there were
this was 2009.
Yeah,
I think.
I mean, you had movies like Stop Loss, but they were just like a lot of anti-war, sort of call it scare quotes, anti-war films in America were just kind of incomprehensible. Like they didn't really understand, and they didn't really go against, call it the like the political side of things so much, in my recollection, as much as it was sort of like, isn't it bad that the soldiers are unhappy right now? Like that's kind of the most, and also like, I mean, Britain is a psychotic country, but it hasn't made an American Sniper yet. Unless 1917 counts, but if they did make a British American Sniper, it would have to be about World War I or World War II.
If they make an American Sniper but British, then have me back on to talk about that.
I can only imagine.
Yeah,
I think that
there was this like air of like unreality about that whole period. Like even I remember that, and I think that's one of the things that the film captures quite well, is like this sense of things sort of sliding out of control.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, I think about this too, that I look back on it, and it's very strange to me because in the US, obviously, like, you know, America got hit on 9/11, and they made up a bunch of bullshit about, you know, they wanted to invade Iraq from day one, but they realized that it was going to be politically challenging. So they had to fabricate this case for it. And the British went along, and the Italians famously went along, and the French went along, as far as like the intelligence, not the actual ground troops. You know, but furnishing intelligence that people knew was bullshit. And you know, basically no one's ever really paid a price for it. You know, you look at British politics, obviously there's a huge swath of this country that was so disgusted by it that like they basically would never support the Labour Party again. But in America, it's very weird to me because it has not had the same kind of fallout, in the sense that I would argue, and maybe it's the same thing here, maybe I'm just being wistful or whatever, I would argue that there is no one in America whose career was truly harmed, call it, well, aside from, say, Colin Powell, who was like their fall guy, no one whose career was truly harmed in being for the war.
No.
But
Absolutely
I cannot
not.
think of anyone whose career was helped by being against the war. And I know lots of people who were basically hounded out of public life for being against the war.
Oh, yeah.
And the level of vitriol that was there at the time was psychotic. I genuinely, like, that's a thing that, from being there and remembering it, like the level of vitriol that was sort of directed at people, and the way you were portrayed if you were someone who was against the war, like, it was, it was a bad time. So it is weird to look back on this and be like, this seems a little bit, you know, a little bit coy, but I'm like, well, you know, in 2009, maybe this was actually like really incisive. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I think a lot of the reviews at the time, which were extremely positive, like, it's a well done movie. It's nice to watch a good film for a change. Were like, how is this going to hold up in our new age of like optimistic Obama-led liberalism? And it turns out really well because nothing changed.
Horns.wav.
Yeah.
It's just, oh my God. Yeah, well, I mean, I think about this too, that like, I don't necessarily know if you could say, okay, none of these are exaggerations. Like, obviously, everything's a send up in a way. But, famously, Alistair Campbell was this much of a slimy fuck with this much of a cozy grip over the media in Britain. I'd say of people I know who've worked on Capitol Hill, I think like the general sort of like constantly running around with your hair on fire reacting to crises sounds about normal.
Yeah, I've from people who've worked there, like I hear positive things about this. Of just being like, yeah, the State Department is this sort of nest of vipers, and like I do enjoy. There's one American staffer in this. I think his name is Chad, but it's kind of a recurring joke.
He's the guy who's been in. The actor has played a character on Silicon Valley. I know that. I recognize his face. This is an earlier role for him, but he plays like the guy who's like almost like puppy doggish loyal to Richard in Silicon Valley. I cannot remember what the character's name is, but yeah, the guy who plays Chad, who's just this like unctuous dweeb.
Yeah, who's like trying to suck up to the sort of the sort of Rumsfeld-Wolfowitz sort of analogy here. Who is this? His name's Linton Barrack, and he's the sort of like the hawk in the State Department.
Yeah.
Like to the point of like carrying around a squash racket in a backpack, hoping to be invited to squash with him. Yeah, no, I appreciated that a lot. And I think that like it's, I don't know, this movie's at its best when it's most cynical, right? And it's at its most cynical when we see the characters who aren't like that, the characters who like have a sort of a modicum of principle, like waver and falter and ultimately like talk themselves into doing the wrong thing. There's one scene where the British minister's in the back of the car with his two advisors, and he's like, well, is it braver to like do the right thing, or is it actually braver to do the wrong thing because you don't want to do it? And I thought that was like just a great sort of epitaph for a lot of New Labour.
I have to ask, like, given the way this film portrays sort of Blair without Blair actually being in the film, do you feel as though that's decently well observed?
Yeah, I think so.
Like what the priorities of Blair's premiership, multiple premierships were.
I think this is something that's like better explored in the thick of it with Blairism and Brownism as this kind of like thing that encouraged sort of like small competing groups of extremely venal and stupid people to bicker about nothing all of the time in order to try and like establish dominance. And meanwhile, you have this sort of like Prince of Darkness communications media figure to like handle the dirty work. I think that rings relatively true, but it's not as explored in this. Like, it's so sort of interested in that moral compromise that it's not willing to even really like get involved with any of the sort of higher level figures.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've never watched The Thick of It. I've just heard people reference it. Like, the famous joke is like, oh, it's just like The Thick of It. But, I mean, this, obviously, I've seen episodes of Veep because my wife's a fan of that show, and I think Armando Ianucci was involved or just did that show. I can't remember what it was.
So, yeah.
But Veep is the exact same style. And, yeah, I guess to me, it's more watching this happen, watching this stuff play out. I'm reminded of the fact that, like, this was how blasé they were about consequences. And, we sort of, to take it on a slightly darker note, we kind of are still living in the aftermath and are going to be living in the aftermath for the rest of our lives.
Oh, yeah.
And, people said that at the time, and, maybe the sort of sensible liberals thought that was hyperbolic, but it's absolutely true. I mean, everything that so much of what we're dealing with in the terms of the politics involved, in America and in Britain and in Europe, like, the insane right-wing resentments and stuff that have come about from all these things, like the refugee crisis spurned by ISIS and by Al-Qaeda and all this stuff, like, that's all of it. Like, there's a direct through line.
Yeah,
like,
and the movie
Iraq.
The movie kind of gets a fun stab at this because it's so difficult, and it was so difficult then too for whatever passed for the left to like articulate any of this. That when the resolution goes through, when the UN resolution authorizing the invasion of, we presume, Iraq goes through, the sort of wavering minister says, "Well, that's it then," and his advisor says, "Was that it? Is that your big line for posterity?" You know, I remember where I was when we declared war. I turned to the minister and he said, "Well, that's it then." And it's just kind of like hopeless. And I appreciated that a lot because it's still very difficult to come to grips with any of this.
I mean, I think about it that in a way, I suppose I would rather somebody whose response was, "Well, that's it then," versus Hillary Clinton when she learned about Gaddafi dying was like, "We came, we saw, he died," or some shit. And it's just
yeah, that's fully like psychotic.
And then everything
stuff.
worked out great in Libya afterward, as we all know. Yeah, I think having watched this, you know, I am reminded of that era's politics and some of the things that are sort of obliquely being referenced. Like you said, the neocon who hates hearing swear words and stuff like that, like the weirdly prudish neocon. In like the credits sequence, there's like a thing of him being mad about like some the movie I Heart Huckabees being recommended film viewing for the military or something like that. Like he's just fucking furious.
I'm pretty certain that happened. Like that's just a takeoff of something that it may have been Rumsfeld, because Rumsfeld was notorious for being just personally insane, and yet also really sort of prudish and banal. Like if you look at, for instance, some of the torture authorization memos. There'll be something in there about, we're going to authorize stress positions for 3 or 4 hours or whatever. And there'll be a handwritten margin note from Rumsfeld that says something like, "Well, I stand for 7 or 8 hours a day. What's the problem with that?" And it's just like, this man is extremely banal and extremely stupid and also extremely malign personally.
Yeah, I don't know if I ever told you this story before. I think I have told it on Hell of a Way, but some of our listeners may not recognize it. That one of the things that I remember being tickled by, if you want to call it that, was some of the weird shit we get in like any soldier care packages, like care packages that are just given out to be given to anyone. So they would get them, they'd dole them out, the USO would dole them out, and we'd just get boxes or just things that were like addressed to any soldier. And invariably it'd be like letters from, Sunday school kids,
like crayon drawing
of you like shooting rockets out of a helicopter somehow, like dropping rockets out of a helicopter, or Jesus stuff, or like some guy. I remember this. He sent a copy of his self-published novel about like a murder mystery in a mine, like an old-timey mine in like a town in Washington or Idaho or something like that. But the mine was called like the Tubal Cain mine, and he just called the book Tubal Cain, but he decided as a cover to have just like, the best way to describe it is like 3D rendered water with a sunset that looked like Wave Race 64. Not really a murder mystery cover. But one of the films that someone had sent, maybe to be as a fuck you to us, maybe it was a future Trashfuture listener, they sent a copy of the documentary of like the Chicago 7, and it was what's it called? Part documentary, part period footage, part like weird bad like flash animation.
Oh no.
And I mean, it was obviously very anti-war and very anti-military. Like, there's lots of stuff of people like, the
Chicago PD, like
Jerry
dragging
Rubin,
Bernie away,
and stuff like that. And whoever the guy was that I said Abby Hoffman, the guy that John Lennon brought on when he guest hosted the Tonight Show, who called Nixon a pig, and like the NBC got fined for this. So like. Anyway, this film, someone must have watched it before me because I found it on the rack of free DVDs that were given out, and someone in a large Sharpie had just written movie on it, but they had spelled it Faget. So I'm just
It's nice to see that they were deploying Pasolini fans.
But that's the thing, right? Is that like, so to me, I feel like now this film was maybe a little bit tongue-in-cheek and probably sympathetic to the, I watched it. I mean, it was fine. It was kind of stupid. Sympathetic to the anti-war cause, but like that's the level of vitriol that it produced in the average person. So I guess in a way that brings me back to the fact that like perhaps just treating this as a comedy and like, you know, having the venality be front and center made this kind of like a more radical statement.
Yeah, I think so. And ultimately, what we see in the movie is the UK provides the intelligence, the Dodgy dossier that allows the UN Security Council to authorize the invasion of Iraq. They fictionalize Ahmed Chalabi, Curveball, as Iceman, this one single informant who is sort of like meth-addled and fictionalizing everything.
Yeah, I was thinking about this too, that basically we didn't go into detail, but the way they create the Dodgy dossier is basically by cutting and pasting and omitting sections from this junior American staffer's sort of research paper on, the case pro and con for war that wound up siding pretty heavily in the con side. And so, like you said, here's this person who thought that she was doing something good with her life and career, and her career big milestone gets butchered up to be used.
We see her at the end attached to Linton Barrack's staff, so she's like fully been subsumed by the machine, which I like. I think it's quietly one of the best things about this movie.
Yeah, and I
have a critique on the other
go
hand.
Ahead, please.
And my critique for this is also Malcolm Tucker. And I meant to say this about 20 minutes ago, and I left that other half of the sentence back there. But like Malcolm Tucker is also the weakest half of this movie because I feel like he's too epic.
That is true. Yeah, I could say that.
He's kind of too designed for like YouTube compilations. Like, if you remember 2009 YouTube and what that was like, Malcolm Tucker destroys whatever. It just kind of like, some of it feels like it's sort of like written for that purpose. And I think it would be a stronger movie if they sort of toned down the sort of like, I don't know, the sort of like explosive aspect of his character.
Yeah, it's basically like Number 10's press office is run by Francis Begbie.
Yeah, Scotland's angriest man.
Yeah, I think also the thing that I would say is I really appreciate James Gandolfini's performance. I will say that I think that one thing it sort of glosses over, oversimplifies, is that by the time that you are of that rank, you kind of have to know how the game is played in Washington because that's where you've been spending a lot of your time.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the discussion that we had that inspired us doing this episode, which was sort of the different personalities of sort of general officers as opposed to your colonels or your Navy captains or whatever. And I said sort of half jokingly that I think colonels are so weird because it's the highest you can get with any of the like really oppositional personality disorders.
Yeah, I would say that too. I would say that, a lot of people don't make it or choose not to stay in to make it to colonel, but the ones who do, like, by and large, that's the end. Like, you have to be confirmed by Congress, and like, the Army's pretty, like, I don't know about the other branches of service. I imagine they're worse because they're so much smaller than the Army, but the Army is pretty blunt. They're like, yeah, you're not getting promoted. Like, we're not putting you up for congressional confirmation and whatnot. And that does have to happen. You have to be confirmed by Congress to be appointed to brigadier general, to any of the general officer ranks. Same for all the other branches of service.
Yeah. And I guess like it makes anyone weirder to potentially stay another, 10, 15, 20 years in the same job where you're not moving upwards.
But that being said, though, somebody as fucking psycho as Mike Flynn managed to get confirmed multiple times. And I think the reason for that is because Mike Flynn was really good at running. So, like, never overestimate how much that counts for things in the Army. Yeah, I was taken aback. I think if I were to say this, I thought Gandolfini weirdly for not being anybody with any military experience, manages to kind of get the sort of bearing of a senior military officer pretty good, pretty well. Because he could have gone Tom Sizemore in Saving Private Ryan and been a little more like that, but that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. I think he does do it pretty convincingly. I would say, to me, his demeanor seems more like something I could believe out of a colonel than a full colonel than out of a general. And maybe it's because I had a boss brigade commander who looked kind of like that and acted kind of like that, but with a little more Malcolm Tucker thrown in when he was mad. So that's one of those things where I think they did a great job casting him, and I'm glad he was in this role because it's fun seeing him do something where he's not just, hey, whoa, I'm Tony Soprano. You know what I mean? Like,
and he does authoritative in a way that I think is quite sort of subtly played, because he's like, obviously James Gandolfini was a big guy, and I think he actually like bulked up a little bit to do this movie, because he uses that sort of physical presence a great deal, and he sort of dominates all of the shots with the sort of the Class A uniform with the like wall of ribbons. Yeah,
kind of a bull in a china shop sort of affect.
Yeah.
It's interesting too. Yeah, you're right. Like, and Tony Soprano had that too. Like in that character, some of these things where he's just sort of like a big guy having to not do big guy things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like having to restrain himself from just being a huge Goomba on people. And I feel like there's that same kind of tension in his portrayal of General Miller. Like it's weird. It's just. This isn't necessarily a movie I'd watch again, but I do appreciate some of the finer details of it. I do appreciate the pacing a lot. Like, that's something that Ianucci is really good at. I mean, all the things I've seen by him, the pacing has been excellent. And so I think, it's a fun movie. I would recommend it. I guess the biggest takeaway that I have, though, is I wonder, like, I wanted to ask you what the sort of general officer archetypes are in the British military. Because I know you've got some deep dives. Because I can tell you the ones in America, but like I'd love to hear the British ones first.
So, I mean, this is me working by reputation. The highest ranking British Army officer I ever met in person was a brigadier. He was very sort of oleaginous, and I feel like that sort of like intensifies. I think that obviously to be a general officer anywhere in the world, you have to be as you say, a little bit politic, and or also possibly an ice chewing psychopath. Yes. But like British Army officers in particular, there's an extra sort of like class tweak on that. So like you'll have I don't know. I'm thinking in particular here of my exemplar is I'm not sure I can remember his first name. Maybe it was Peter. Yeah, General Sir Peter de la Billière, or to give him his full name, General Sir Peter Edgar de la Cour de la Billière, KCB, KBE, DSOM, and Bar, who commanded the SAS during the First Gulf War, and was very much in this sort of mold of very, very tall, very willowy, sort of shock of grey hair, incomprehensible aristocratic features going on, and just sort of like it's a very distinct bearing. And I think that's one bearing that like senior British military officers sort of share in common, where it's much more sort of restrained and much more upright. And I don't think you could get a sort of like British analog for James Gandolfini to do this.
It's funny because the only general officer I've ever seen who I thought might be close in bearing an affect to James Gandolfini was Ray Odierno, who was the chief of staff of the army, and who also was the commander, if I'm not mistaken, of I believe the 1st Infantry. He was a commander in Iraq during the handover from the initial invasion. And he was, if you ever heard a story of a guy named Nate Sassaman, who was a lieutenant colonel, whose men decided to enforce curfew on an Iraqi town they were in charge of by grabbing curfew violators and throwing them off a river bridge. Ray Odierno was the commander who basically told them, like, crack down hard and fucking punish them for breaking the rules and stuff like that. Like, if there's ever one officer I can think of who, like, his personal dictates in terms of, like, what the attitudes he wanted people to carry forward made the insurgency worse, like, just like from the top down, it was like they were setting out to make the insurgency worse. It's Ray Odierno. So yeah,
it's interesting what this movie does with General Miller and the sort of the aftermath, which is we see him this whole movie sort of preparing to resign in protest, and then once the war actually happens, he decides that he can't, right? And we're not.
Yeah.
Where in every other character this is sort of treated as moral cowardice, here it's sort of like it's much more sympathetic. His deal is that, like, his loyalty is to his men. In fact, I think he calls them, like, the kids.
Kids, yeah.
And now that the war is actually happening, he wants to stay in and, like, prosecute it as like effectively as possible. And that's kind of like, that's a 2009 piece of ideology.
100% agree with you.
It's like, if it were done to it were done quickly, and with, like, minimum bloodshed.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking about, you know the story. In a way, it felt like some of General Miller's skepticism reminded me of Eric Shinseki. You know, for those of you who are not familiar with his story, Eric Shinseki was, I believe, the Secretary of the Army or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I can't remember what position he was in. And he basically, I believe publicly, but certainly in preparation balked at the White House's and the Defense Department's plan for Iraq, basically saying that would not be anywhere near enough troops to actually secure this country once we invaded. And Rumsfeld was not happy with him having said this, so Rumsfeld nominated his successor out of the blue, which basically was like, oh yeah, by the way, in 9 months, you're fired. And that kind of, like, put the damper on Shinseki. And then Shinseki retired and got asked to run the VA under Obama, and to mixed results, according to some people that I know. So
there's another general officer I can think of, which is Wesley Clark.
Yes.
There's a little there's a line where Miller is in a cocktail party, and the assistant secretary of state's like, "What's this I hear about you thinking about running for office?" And he sort of laughs it off. But I think in 2009, I think it was still this sort of, like, plausible thing, and I think a lot of liberals would have loved it if we had a progressive retired general officer to, like, be Eisenhower too.
I mean, let's be perfectly honest with the state of liberals in America. If Jim Mattis decided to run as a Democrat, despite having all Republican policies, they would support it.
That's, God, depressing. But yes.
Yeah, it's funny. Wesley Clark had a nickname of being the Prince of Darkness because apparently working for him was hell, and, like, he just, like, he was proud of how hard he ran his staff, and, like, I don't know if he was necessarily proud of how many divorces he caused, but, like, that's the kind of guy you're dealing with. Like, it's very easy for a general officer, and that's the thing. Like, to talk a little bit about American general officer archetypes, I don't really have a lot, but I will say that most of the ones I've met have had a kind of, like, Fortune 500 CEO / game show host sort of delivery. Like, they're very incredibly articulate and, like, extremely sort of, like, I'm commanding the room that I'm in kind of, like, presence wherever they go. And obviously some of that is done to just the sheer absurdity of their rank. The fact that, like, they've got, like, colonels and lieutenant colonels running around, like, getting coffee for them and stuff like that. It's just always absurd when you see the sort of procession. But invariably, they seem to almost all have great hair and be really tall, and just have this kind of like, you know, most successful real estate agent in California sort of, like, demeanor to them. It's very, very strange, because most Army officers are not like that. And I swear, most Army officers, even the ones who go on to become generals, aren't like that when they put
you
officers
into a big machine. You get off the subway to get into the Pentagon, and they put you through a big machine that, like, fixes your teeth and, like, gives you hair plugs and makes you lose 20 to 50 pounds.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I don't know. I just think about some of these people. But then again, like, there's always Mike Flynn. I mean, Mike Flynn, it's very funny to me, and fans of the show know this story because I'm constantly bringing this up. But when I was on the Task and Purpose podcast, Task and Purpose Radio, talking about the Serial season that covered the Bergdahl story, there was an interview where Sarah Koenig was speaking with Mike Flynn, and Mike Flynn was like basically like shouting her down and being very hostile and combative, and basically like saying like, I don't need to provide evidence that Bergdahl got American soldiers killed. He just did. And, you know, we reacted to it. And one of my co-hosts was like, yeah, this is just sort of like a weird kind of like aggressive sort of mansplaining kind of thing from a general. Like, it's strange to see him get so incensed. And I was like, yeah, I feel like listening to him is just a reminder that like so often times you meet general officers and they seem so impressive that you forget that some of them are complete fucking idiots. And the producer of the show at the time was sort of like, yeah, man, I don't know if we can keep that in. He's like, we've had Mike Flynn like write articles for Task and Purpose before. Like, I don't know if we can call him an idiot. And I was like, well, he's a fucking moron. I stand by that. This was in like January 2016. Guess who was proven right? Guess who was not
vindicated?
Exactly. Yeah. And I will never, ever let that go.
I think it's very funny to talk about like the popular imagination of the general officer, the American general officer, because like we've got like Trump's hot general. I love the hot general so much. Those brief moments before they refused to do a coup d'etat for him, when Donald Trump was extremely awed by all of these guys. But like also you've got who am I thinking of here? Come back to me. I'll think of it.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, I mean, I guess ultimately, it's not
Mark Milley. Speaking of like General Miller, because like he like current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as I understand it, was like testifying to Congress about and one of the various like congressional chuds asked him about critical race theory, and he gave this long answer that was like, well, I think that we should be anti-racist, and also I think we should read stuff and understand it, and I've read Mao and I've read Lenin and all of this, which is fine, but like what I'm more interested in is the response, which was a bunch of guys like Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro going, "Oh, the military is gay now. This guy's a pussy." And you sort of think, "Huh, okay, let me look at this guy. Let me look at this general who they're calling a pussy. Let me see." And he looks, no, absolutely not. He looks terrifying. And
yeah, I'm just looking at his uniform, and so I don't know if you know this, but on the right-hand side of your uniform, if you're an officer, you have little straight stripes, that those are on your uniform for 6-month increments of how long you've spent in combat. So for every 6 months you spend in combat, you get to add another bar. So I spent 13 months. I had 2 bars on my dress uniform. These would be called, I believe they would call these service stripes, but I can't, or combat stripes, but I can't remember what the correct term was.
Yeah, and he has like a forearm's worth.
He's got 12. He spent 6 years in combat. Like, yeah, he's done 6 full year deployments over his career. So like,
and he did all of that despite being a beta soy boy cuck.
Exactly. Besides being the woke gay military who wants to make everybody, they just want to talk about feelings and like that. There was a post recently where somebody basically said that if we don't cut down this millennial tendency towards like quitting when you're not feeling good, then like the president will quit or something, and then China will nuke us.
Yes. Yeah.
This was Zaid Jilani saying it, in case you were wondering. But yes, basically, gymnastics and nuclear war are the same. I in a way, it seems like a document from a slightly more innocent time, despite it talking about like one of what I believe will still endure no matter what as like one of the great crimes of this century. It's very strange.
It weirdly kind of soft pedals that a little bit. And I guess that's maybe sort of a consequence of it being about the lead up to it, where like,
yeah.
But I don't know. It's kind of like, I can't tell if it's purposeful or not. The sort of the worst thing that any of these people can imagine, apart from Miller, is that it's going to be like bad. It's going to be a mistake. It's going to be a misstep, but it's not going to be this sort of like enduring foreign policy disaster that the war in Iraq actually was. And and Miller gets this line, it's the problem with civilians wanting to go to war, is that once you've been to war, you never want to go back unless you absolutely have to. It's like France.
Yeah. I mean, it's I got to be honest with you. I found some of that stuff to be a little platitudey, but that's probably just because like this is basically war Veep. So
sure.
Yeah, go figure. But I also think, yeah, like you said, at the time it was made, there was certainly in Britain and maybe even in America a consensus that it was a disaster, and so now we have to do like disaster Kremlinology, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
about sort of like how
could this have happened?
Yes,
with all of these sort of like ineffectual and wavering, but often broadly well-intentioned people. Like you even see Malcolm Tucker, who again in this movie threatens to like hound a guy to an early grave. Look at sort of like he hands off the dossier full of like falsified intelligence, and he gets a sort of like a look of sort of like looming regret and horror, and it's quite ambivalent. And it's like, well, okay, but like, no, some of these people were fully on board with this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think the extent to which in the neocon imagination this was going to be this masterstroke that created a new American golden age. It's hard to overstate. And they were
and like not even neocons, because like there are neocons in this movie, but like the extent to which a lot of I think it's too kind. I think it's a bit revisionist in the way it portrays a lot of sort of nice, soft, squishy liberals as going along with this. Because I think there was like, I don't know, the thing that I remember from the British discourse about that time was Christopher Hitchens talking about Islamofascism or like muscular liberalism or the Euston Manifesto. And I think a lot of people who you can now embarrass by like finding the things that they said and did in 2003 and go this you on Twitter and get blocked, have sort of like, if you want to like include them in this movie, if you want to like say that these archetypes of like staffers and like wonks and policy people and junior ministers speak to them too, are getting off quite easily.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that there was such a profound, enraged desire for revenge at all costs, no matter who got hurt in the process.
Yeah.
And I think there was an extent to which Saddam Hussein had entered into like the American consciousness as this sort of boogeyman because he didn't die in the Gulf War. Now, never mind the people, who it was who gave him his chemical weapons arsenal in the first place. We definitely won't talk about that.
Yeah, definitely wasn't literally one of the same guys. I don't know, have you ever seen the footage of Rumsfeld being confronted with the video of him shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in the 80s?
No.
I don't remember who, but some news program showed it to him on camera, and in typical psychopath mode, he's just like, "Well, there I am. Isn't that interesting?" And it's like that's all the insight that you're going to get out of this guy.
Yeah, I mean, I remember this. Nobody ever tried to make this into like a "we found WMDs" story, but there are a number of American service members who were exposed to chemical weapons in Iraq. And the reason for this is they happened upon, either because these were bombs set by the insurgents, but primarily they just were depots where they uncovered caches.
Oh yeah, they found like a lot of buried chemical weapons, right?
Yes, and these were pre-1991 chemical munitions. But nobody had, these were not soldiers that were sent out to do NBC or Seaburn decon. They were just troops, they happened upon a big, cache of like, let's call it, 500, 155
like
round millimeter artillery
full
rounds.
Of like sarin or tabun that's been decaying in the sand for
when they weren't even,
years.
it was nothing like sarin. I think most of them were like chlorine gas or mustard gas. And these things were leaking, they were corroded, and people developed lesions. They got lightheaded, they passed out. People thought they were heat casualties, but they weren't. These people had, follow-on effects. Some of them have been exposed to stuff that has led to them getting cancer. And I'll give you a couple of details that have stayed with me The story was by a guy named Chris Chivers, or CJ Chivers. He's like the New York Times' senior military.
Huge fan of his work.
Yeah, great guy. A personal friend. He's really, really nice guy. Has been a huge supporter of our show and stuff we do. He's really nice, really nice guy. He wrote that story, and in response to it, the Department of Defense put up a number and contact info for soldiers who thought they had been exposed to this to get in touch, and then had to come back and clarify, please do not contact this number if you were exposed to it in the Gulf War. We're only talking about 2003 onwards, because they were deluged with people who had Gulf War syndrome. And it's like, that's something that they're like, we're not going to talk about that. But like, something happened that has affected people there, whether it was depleted uranium, whether it was like the way stuff was stored in the heat, whether it was chemical weapons deployed, who knows? But like,
weird anti-malarials and stuff.
Yeah,
like
you
can be. I mean, this is the thing. I sort of did a joking thread about this ages and ages ago on Twitter, where I said that like, if you served in the U.S. military between the years of like 1950 to present, it's highly likely that your commanding officer was actually like a large lump of nerve gas disguised as a guy, as part of like a Fort Detrick experiment to see how many different kinds of cancer they could give you.
Yeah, I mean, like, my mom, I think, was too young to get smallpox vaccination, or if she did, maybe she got as a little kid. I don't know. She's born in the 50s. Maybe she got it. What I do know is that they stopped inoculating people in the army for smallpox on the regular in 1990 because there's no need anymore. But then they decided for people deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan, they would anyway. So I actually have a smallpox scar on my arm, despite being way too young to have gotten it, you know, like on the civilian side. We also got shot up with the anthrax vaccine, which, I mean, I've heard of some people having side effects with and stuff like that. So like,
you can absolutely get extremely paranoid justifiably with this. It's like it's a lot like people who like think that the CIA is responsible for, you know, whichever mysterious symptoms, and like you go into it quite naively thinking, oh, well, that's just paranoia, and then you read about the stuff that the CIA admits to having done, and you're just like, oh, yeah, okay, well, probably.
But the thing that I'll close out on too is that the other detail that I wanted to harp on about that Chris Chivers article is that nobody who wasn't like Michelle Malkin tried to turn around and be like, see, we found WMDs, because it was very clear from the beginning, all of those WMDs were made from precursors that the U.S. sold to Saddam in the 80s.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, there were WMDs and people did encounter them and find them in Iraq. They were WMDs that we gave Saddam to use to massacre the Iranians and the Kurds with. So once again, you know, like I hold to my position that this is probably going to still remain, you know, if we all live to be 110 plus years old and it becomes the 22nd century, like this will remain one of the great crimes of the 21st century is what they did in Iraq. And like I said, this film was an interesting sort of vignette of late 2000s sort of reckoning, but none of like the true apocalypse has visited us that's happened since.
You've given me an idea.
What's that?
Something that I want to come back on and talk about, which you may have talked about it already, in fact. The movie Three Kings.
Oh, we've never talked about it, but I love that movie, yeah.
It's a great film.
It's incredible.
Some real Gulf War I action.
Yeah, I would really want to watch it again. I do find it very interesting that, America certainly can never make a good war movie about an ongoing war. And oftentimes I think wars that have grand reckonings make for bad movies. But yeah, the Gulf War is an interesting one. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about that with you. We've talked about Jarhead. We've never talked about Three Kings on this show, I don't believe. So yeah, you're welcome to. And we're coming up on a little over an hour, so I was just going to say, Alice, thank you so much. And
my
please plug your many, many great podcasts to our listeners.
Well, this is sort of like, should be familiar to many of you as part of the Nate Bethea extended universe, since you produce most of these. I am on a podcast called Trashfuture. I am on a podcast called Kill James Bond. If you like or hate James Bond movies, and I'm on a podcast with Slides on YouTube called Well, There's Your Problem, about engineering disasters.
They're all great shows. You should check them out. I think we have not done a joint episode with Kill James Bond, but we've done a joint episode with everyone else. So you should recognize those voices.
The hell of a way, well, there's your problem, has been just absolutely fantastic. We did one about the Osprey.
We did.
Which you can find on either of our Patreon feeds. So
that's correct. And we did an episode for you guys about the
Bradley armored fighting vehicle.
Yes, that's correct. So, Alice, thank you so much for making time for this on a lovely Saturday in
my pleasure.
The eternal autumn of the United Kingdom. And for all of you listening out there, thank you so much for being Patreon supporters. And we will speak to you later this week.